Hello, welcome to the unit on metabolism, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. This unit is about the changes that constitute being alive, the changes in metabolism. The word metabolism is based on the Greek root word for change, and that is what being alive is all about, is change. The learning objectives that we'll be covering are listed here on slide 1. I'm not going to read through all of them right now, but we're going to go through these. We'll start with the first learning objective here about explaining what metabolism is and how it relates to energy. And we'll see that the idea of energy is one of the fundamental ideas in this unit. So energy and metabolism both relate to an idea called equilibrium. Equilibrium means no net change. It doesn't mean no change at all, but it means that any changes that there are offset each other. So you're really not going anywhere and you're not changing overall. There's no net change. You're always going to be at equilibrium unless you put energy into a system. If you don't put energy in, then the system is going to reach equilibrium. The relevance that this has to biology is that equilibrium is death. When there's no net change, like at equilibrium, then things are not alive. Life is about change. Life then needs to take in and use energy in order to continue to change, to continue to live. Since life is change, then life needs to involve energy. Metabolism is the change due to using energy. Or in other words, it's the idea of avoiding equilibrium. Meta, change, change due to using energy, avoiding equilibrium, avoiding the lack of change, avoiding death. Metabolism is avoiding equilibrium. We avoid reaching the equilibrium of a number of different processes, but we can easily understand metabolism. I almost said evolution, but I meant metabolism. If we look at one particular reaction that we avoid the equilibrium of, that's this overall reaction of the metabolism of a fuel. So the fuel here is glucose. The chemical formula of glucose is C6H12O6 because it has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Glucose, a source of energy, a fuel for metabolism, is going to be oxidized by oxygen. Oxygen molecules, it'll take 6 of them to oxidize, 6 oxygen molecules to oxidize 1 molecule of glucose. And we'll get from it 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water molecules, and energy. And it's that energy that the whole process is all about. This whole reaction, we avoid equilibrium in the reaction. That means we keep the reaction going, we keep changing things by changing the concentrations of both the reactants and the products. The reactants are these things before the arrow, and we change those concentrations by eating fuel and by breathing in oxygen. We change the concentrations of the products of the reaction by breathing out to get rid of carbon dioxide and by urinating to get rid of water. So metabolism is change, avoiding equilibrium. And a great example is the change in this reaction. We avoid the equilibrium of this reaction. We'll see that this reaction is important in metabolism as we go further. Now, when we talk about energy, we're going to end up talking a lot about favorable and unfavorable processes, or favorable and unfavorable reactions, chemical reactions, or favorable and unfavorable things in addition to the chemical reactions processes. Favorable things are favorable because they release energy. So like a rock rolling down a hill, That happens spontaneously. It happens on its own. As long as the rock is at the top of the hill, it will roll down. Nobody has to do anything about it. It happens spontaneously, and it releases energy. You know that it releases energy because you could do work using that process, and energy is defined as the ability to do work. So if we put a rock at the top of a hill, we could put a turnstile or something and have the rock roll past it and do some work for us. Water running down a hill is used to run a water wheel, and that's doing work for us. Okay? Spontaneous things release energy, and they happen because they're favorable. Unfavorable things require energy. You have to put energy in, and they don't happen spontaneously unless you put the energy in. That's like pushing a rock uphill. If you put a rock at the bottom of a hill, it will not spontaneously go up the hill. The reason is that it's an unfavorable thing that requires energy in order to happen. You can make a rock go uphill, but only if you put energy in. If you put energy in, then you can do an unfavorable thing, and we'll see that that happens. Now the question is, how does this relate to biology? And that's where we go with the next learning objective. Remember, in the section on molecules of life, we talked about a couple of different kinds of reactions that happen a lot in life: hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis. Hydrolysis is breaking things down by introducing a water molecule. Hydrolysis is a favorable process, and breaking things down releases energy. So when we have two parts of a molecule that are stuck together, and we introduce water between them, breaking them into two different molecules. Here they're called monomers. They can be the monomers of a polymer, but they could also be different parts of another molecule. That breaking them down by introducing water is hydrolysis. Okay? Breaking things down is generally, usually, almost always, spontaneous and favorable. We go down in energy. We release energy. So energy comes off, is created by the reaction, by the process. Synthesis is the other way around. Synthesis, putting things together, requires energy. It's unfavorable. To make something, you have to put some energy in. If we take two monomers or two molecules that we can do a dehydration synthesis on and remove a water and putting them together, forming a new bond between them, that will take energy. That reaction won't be spontaneous, won't be favorable, and won't happen on its own unless we put energy in. But we do a lot of these kinds of synthesis reactions in life. We will see that we put DNA together using dehydration synthesis. We put RNA together. We put proteins together. We do a whole lot of biosynthetic reactions that involve going uphill in energy. Well, how in the world do we do that? That's one of the principal things that we need to understand in this chapter. The next learning objective talks about another type of biological chemical reaction, a biochemical reaction, a chemical reaction that happens in biological systems that is related to energy as well. This is oxidation. Oxidation of organic compounds plays an important role in metabolism. Oxidation of organic compounds means to have more bonds between carbon and oxygen. So if we have a carbon compound, then increasing the number of bonds to oxygen to those of those carbon atoms to bonds to oxygen is oxidation. And this is a really important point here. In an atmosphere with oxygen, molecular oxygen, oxidation is favorable. That is, it releases energy and it is spontaneous. An example of an oxidation reaction is shown here on slide 10. We have an organic molecule, methane, and we have oxygen from the environment. oxygen gas, there's 2 molecules of oxygen here, can react with the methane, and we'll get carbon dioxide. Now the carbon is, instead of being bonded to hydrogens, it's bonded to carbons. The hydrogens now combine with some of the oxygens and we get water, and we also get energy as an output. This reaction, this kind of oxidation, is also called combustion, and I bet that you use this reaction today because methane is natural gas, and you probably burn some natural gas in a water heater in order to take a shower, or if it's during winter time, you probably use some natural gas in a furnace to keep your house warm. And what was going on was that natural gas, the methane in it, was oxidizing, combusting, combining with oxygen to make carbon dioxide and water and to release energy that you use to heat the water or the air in your house. The oxidation means that the carbon has more bonds to oxygen. Here carbon has no bonds to oxygen, 0. Here carbon has 2 bonds to this oxygen and 2 bonds to that oxygen, so a total of 4 bonds to oxygen, and that means that it's become oxidized. Oxidation doesn't have to be complete combustion to release energy, though. This is the complete combustion of glucose here. So glucose is an organic molecule that we've seen before. It has 6 carbons and 6 oxygens and 12 hydrogens, and it's shown here. And if we count the number of bonds between carbons and oxygens, we see that there are 7 bonds between a carbon atom and an oxygen atom. If we completely combust it, we get it all the way to carbon dioxide, and there are nothing but carbon-oxygen bonds. There are no bonds to anything else. No carbon-carbon bonds, no carbon-hydrogen bonds. That's complete oxidation or combustion. What's shown here below is partial oxidation, meaning that we increase the number of bonds between carbon and oxygen, but we don't combust it all the way to carbon dioxide. Glucose can be combusted partly, or oxidized, not combusted partly, it's partially oxidized to a compound called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Pyruvate has fewer carbons because there are only 3 carbons in it, so we get 2 pyruvates per glucose, but it has more bonds between carbon atoms and oxygen atoms. These dotted lines mean that that's like 1.5 bonds. That's a chemical aspect called resonance that we won't worry about, but you can think of it as a double bond to one of the oxygens and a single bond to the other, or 1.5 bonds to each. So that's 1.5 plus 1.5, that's 3, 4, 5. This is a double bond between an oxygen and a carbon. So 5 bonds between carbon and oxygen in each of the 2 pyruvate molecules. That's a total of 10 bonds to oxygen. We went from 7 to 10. Now we are more oxidized, and this reaction gives up energy. We can use it to harvest energy. Okay, in the next learning objective, we're going to talk more about energy as we talk about an energy holding compound, a chemical that we can use as a source of energy, a chemical that the cell uses as its energy currency, called ATP. ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency, or the cash in the energy economy of cells. What do we mean by that, and how does it work? Well, ATP is not some magic way that energy is held. Instead, ATP is considered an energy-containing molecule because breaking it down releases energy. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. This complicated part of the molecule here is called adenosine, and there are 1, 2, 3 phosphates next to each other, so that makes it adenosine monoditriphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, has these phosphates next to each other with their negative charges. That's not very happy. They would like to be away from each other. The negative charges repel each other. If we hydrolyze by introducing a water molecule, hydrolyze one of these phosphates, break it off, then we get a DP, adenosine diphosphate, adenosine monodiphosphate, plus phosphate and energy. Energy is released. This is a very favorable reaction that releases a lot of energy, and so the ATP is seen as sort of a source of energy. Now, we can couple favorable reactions and unfavorable reactions in a way that we will talk about later. That means we can couple things that release energy with things that require energy to make both of them happen at the same time. For instance, something unfavorable like lifting a 5 kilogram weight. Will a 5 kilogram weight just spontaneously rise from the ground? Of course it won't. That's an unfavorable, energy requiring, non-spontaneous thing for 5 kilograms to go up. What about 20 kilograms falling? Well, that's favorable. Anytime you have 20 kilograms that isn't on the floor already or sitting on something, if you have just 20 kilograms in the air, it will fall. That is favorable, spontaneous, and energy releasing. Now, what if you could couple this falling to the rising of the 5 kilogram weight? So you couple one of these processes, the favorable process, with the unfavorable process. Couple the favorable falling of the 20 kilogram weight. Using a pulley, you couple it to the lifting, the rising of the 5 kilogram weight. If they're coupled, both things will happen. The favorable and the unfavorable thing will happen together. Notice that the favorable thing has to be more favorable than the unfavorable thing is unfavorable. Could we lift a 20-pound weight by dropping a 20 kilogram weight by dropping a 5 kilogram weight? Of course not, because we only get a certain amount of energy after dropping a 5 kilogram weight, and it's not enough energy to lift a 20 kilogram one. But if we drop something heavier, then it can lift something lighter. If we do a favorable thing, as long as it's more favorable, then we can get an unfavorable thing to happen as well. Now, ATP is the most frequently coupled favorable ATP hydrolysis that we saw back here. ATP being broken down is the most frequently coupled favorable reaction in cells. So that means that ATP is the energy currency of the cells. Dollars are called currency in the financial economy because they're the most frequently exchanged things of value. We all recognize the value of a dollar. Yeah, we all agree that the value of the dollar is going down, but it has value. Everybody wants one, or more than one. ATP is recognized by a bunch of processes in the cell as the favorable thing, the thing that you can get some energy from by hydrolyzing it. So we call ATP the energy currency of the cell. It's like money. All right. How do we use ATP? How do we couple favorable and unfavorable reactions in living things? And how do we do chemical reactions in metabolism? The answer is enzymes. Enzymes are tremendously important in biology, in all of the chemical reactions of biology, including the reactions of metabolism. So we're going to have to describe and understand how enzymes work. To understand how enzymes work, we have to start out by pointing out that most organic reactions are slow. A really good example of a chemical reaction is probably right in front of you right now. Somewhere around you, even though you're looking at a computer, is probably a piece of paper. Maybe you're taking notes on a piece of paper, or you certainly have paper around you sometimes during your education. Paper is always undergoing a chemical reaction. Paper is mostly made of glucose. Glucose polymerized together in a polymer called cellulose. And glucose, and therefore cellulose, is always being broken down into carbon dioxide and water. But it's going very, very slowly. If you take that piece of paper that's in front of you and you look at it in a few hours or a few days, you won't notice that it's any different. But what if you come back and look at it in a few decades or in a few hundred years, or like this piece of papyrus paper, in a few thousand years? This paper has been oxidizing for thousands of years, and it's literally falling apart because the paper is literally turning into carbon dioxide and water. But it's not going very fast. It's going very, very slowly. Well, the reactions of organic chemistry are mostly slow. And organic chemistry is the kind of chemistry that happens in cells. But cells don't have to wait around for reactions to go that slowly because they have enzymes. The reason that reactions are slow is that they have big activation energy. So we talked about a favorable reaction being like rolling a rock down a hill. But a reaction is not just a change in energy from the reactants to the products. There's a period between them. And so the form between them, called the transition state, that form can be in higher energy than either the reactants or the products. If there weren't a hill here, all of the reactants would already be products. We wouldn't observe the chemical reaction because all we would observe is the products. But in a slow reaction, there's a hill that you have to get the rock over before it will finally tumble to the end. So paper oxidizing is favorable. Paper will eventually spontaneously oxidize and become carbon dioxide and water. But why is it not oxidizing fast? Because it has this energy of activation barrier, or activation energy barrier, that it has to get over. You can help that. If you take a piece of paper, you can put some energy in, like light a match under it. And what will happen? Well, then the whole paper will combust, completely oxidizing, becoming carbon dioxide and water really quickly. That happened because you put energy in. But and the burning paper will end up putting more energy, more total energy out. Your burning match put a little bit of energy in to get you to the top of this hill, but then the whole reaction put more energy out. And you could, warm your house by burning paper. Don't try that though, please. That slow reaction is slow because of how high this energy of activation barrier is. Enzymes are catalysts. Catalysts make reactions fast. How do they make reactions fast? They decrease the height of the energy activation, the activation energy hill. I keep saying energy of activation because that's one way that this is termed, but activation energy is another. When you use an enzyme, the energy of activation, or the activation energy, is shorter, smaller, and so the reaction doesn't have to wait for as long to get enough energy to actually happen. The reaction goes a lot faster. The activation energy is shrunk by having an enzyme. Okay, how in the world does an enzyme do that? An enzyme is a protein. Remember in the section on the molecules of life that we talked about proteins as large, complicated molecules. And we said that there are thousands of different proteins in a human being. In fact, you have genes that encode from your DNA in a way that we'll see later in the course, tens of thousands of different proteins. And most of those proteins, well over half of them, the majority of them, are enzymes. Here on this slide we see an example of a protein. This three-dimensional shape is the shape of that molecule. All these little bumps are individual atoms, and there are actually thousands of atoms. This is a relatively small protein, but there are thousands of atoms in this molecule. This spaghetti stuff and these coils and strands are the structural elements of the protein. If we just trace the amino acid chain through the whole protein, we would trace through all of these lines. This protein folds into its three-dimensional shape, and in that three-dimensional shape there's this surface. This surface, that is this crevice here, is the special surface that makes catalysis happen. That's where the reactants, called substrates, the reactants of an enzyme catalyzed reaction, sit and get positioned with each other so that the energy of activation, the activation energy barrier, becomes lower. It's the shape and configuration of the enzyme, that special surface on the enzyme, that makes catalysis happen, that makes the reactions go faster. That's what enzymes do. They make reactions go faster. But what does that have to do with energy? Well, some enzymes, not all, in fact, not even a majority, just a few, but some enzymes make unfavorable reactions go by coupling them to favorable reactions. Some enzymes, not the majority, but some, catalyze more than one reaction at a time, 2 or sometimes even more than 2 reactions. A favorable reaction and an unfavorable reaction, that couples them. And coupling the reactions allows the unfavorable thing to happen because the favorable thing is happening. For instance, we can have an enzyme that is catalyzing the reaction, putting A and B together to make a new compound, AB. Now that's a synthesis reaction, and it might be energetically unfavorable. Let's say that it is unfavorable. But you need to make AB because maybe AB is a growing protein or a growing piece of DNA or something. And you need to put the pieces together. How do you do something that you have to do that's unfavorable? How do you get the 5 kilogram mass, 5 kilogram weight, to rise? The answer is you couple it to something that's favorable. So on this same enzyme, not only do we catalyze A and B becoming AB, but we also catalyze ATP getting hydrolyzed to ADP and phosphate. That is favorable, and this is unfavorable. Together, the whole thing will happen, so that the unfavorable thing happens because you're spending some ATP money, some ATP energy. You're dropping a heavy weight in order to lift the lighter weight. The enzyme is like the pulley. It's the thing that couples them together. All right, now that we understand a little bit about how enzymes catalyze the reactions of metabolism, including coupling the higher energy or favorable reactions with unfavorable reactions, now let's actually look at the changes that constitute metabolism in a cell. What are the reactions that make a cell move forward, a cell live? So this learning objective is about the process of cellular respiration. Respiration means breathing, but it means the changes of energy metabolisms. Cellular energy being changed. The product of cellular respiration is ATP. Okay? We want to, in addition to understanding what cellular respiration is, we want to find out where it occurs and what it is what changes, what are the things that change. So cellular respiration is how cells avoid equilibrium, how they make ATP so that they can run their unfavorable processes. We said that we were avoiding the equilibrium of this reaction, glucose being oxidized to carbon dioxide and water, and that releases energy. And we can see that that energy has been harvested in the form of ATP. So if breaking ATP down liberates energy, making ATP must take energy. But here we made ATP. Where did we get the energy to make the ATP? We coupled it with the oxidation of glucose. Oxidation of glucose releases energy, and we capture some of that energy as ATP. And then later we can couple the breaking down of ATP with other unfavorable things. So this is cellular respiration, taking metabolic fuels like glucose or fat, oxidizing them to make carbon dioxide and water and ATP, which is the form of energy that we can use in the cell. It's the cell's energy money. Cellular respiration happens in a whole bunch of different reactions. Instead of just running one reaction, now can you run glucose oxidation, glucose combustion as one reaction? Yes, you can. For instance, you can light paper on fire, and that will create carbon dioxide and water. It will use up oxygen from the atmosphere, and it will burn up the glucose, turning it into carbon dioxide and water. That releases energy, but it releases it in one fell swoop. In order to more efficiently harvest the energy from oxidation of glucose, we can break glucose oxidation up into many steps. And those are the reactions of cellular respiration. Going from glucose to glucose and oxygen to carbon dioxide and water. So these are the inputs. Glucose and oxygen are the inputs, and they're changed to carbon dioxide and water. And we use about 30 independent molecular reaction or biochemical reactions going from glucose all the way to carbon dioxide and water, glucose and oxygen. Those reactions are arranged in pathways of reactions, where one reaction leads to another. One pathway is called glycolysis. That takes glucose to pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Another pathway is called pyruvate oxidation. That takes pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Another pathway is the citric acid cycle. That takes acetyl-CoA all the way to carbon dioxide and creates these high energy electron carriers that go into the last pathway called the electron transport chain that then incorporates oxygen and makes water. And all of these pathways harvest energy along the way to get a total of about 3 dozen ATPs. 3 dozen molecules of ATP are made from each glucose molecule that we put through the whole process. Many of these processes take part in a part of the cell called the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion is an organelle in the cell that you might remember from the section on cells, or that if you haven't gotten to that section yet, that you hopefully will remember as the powerhouse of the cell. It's called the powerhouse of the cell because it's about energy. It's about getting the ATP that the cell needs to do all of its unfavorable reactions. Where does it get the ATP? It has to get that energy from somewhere. It gets it from oxidizing glucose. Okay? Now, where does the glucose come from? And for that matter, where does the oxygen come from that feed into this process? Well, that's where we're going with the next learning objective. There's an opposite process in some ways, a process that instead of using sugars, makes sugars. Instead of using oxygen, it makes oxygen. It's called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, I'm sure you know, happens in plants, but it happens in a particular part of plants. And we also want to understand what its changes are and how they relate to energy. Photosynthesis is how plants fix energy. That means sort of how they trap it, and also how they fix carbon. That means how they trap the carbon from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not biological carbon. It's not organic. But we're going to take that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere inside of plants, combine it with water, and make glucose out of it. And you'll see that if you add up the oxygens, there are too many oxygens from water and carbon dioxide to be included in glucose, so oxygen gas is also made as another product. But you might say, wait, that's the same reaction we saw just a few slides ago. It's glucose and oxygen on one side and carbon dioxide and water on the other side, but this is the direction that liberates energy. If you go in the other direction, where you start with carbon dioxide and water and go to glucose and oxygen, then don't you have to put in energy? And the answer is you do. Photosynthesis not only traps or fixes carbon into carbohydrates, including glucose, it also fixes or traps energy from the sun. It uses the energy of the sun. So the absorbance of light energy is the favorable process that is coupled to this unfavorable reaction so that they both happen and you end up making glucose and oxygen. The process of photosynthesis happens inside a part of plant cells that is a subcellular organelle, a little bit like a mitochondrion, but it's called a chloroplast. And it's from the Greek word for green, because it's green. It has green light-absorbing pigments called chlorophyll. Those green light-absorbing pigments are found on little membranes in the chloroplast called thylakoid membranes. Those green particles absorb light energy, and they they use some of that energy to turn water into oxygen and to turn low energy compounds, ADP and NADP+, into high energy compounds, ATP and NADPH. Those high energy compounds are then used to take carbon dioxide and make sugar with it, glucose. All right, so the photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. It's basically the reverse of cellular respiration, but it can happen because we're putting in energy from the light. This means that there is in the biosphere an interrelationship between photosynthesis in plants and cellular respiration in not only plants but everybody else. Photosynthesis happens in the chloroplasts. Here you can see what the thylakoid membranes look like. They're these little stacks. They are green because they have light-absorbing chlorophyll, and that absorbs the energy of light, and that energy gets put into making glucose and oxygen. Glucose and oxygen are then combined in oxidation reactions, not only inside the plants, but also inside animals and bacteria and everybody else in the biosphere. In all of us eukaryotes, it happens in an organelle called a mitochondrion. And in the mitochondrion, we do cellular respiration, and we use the energy that is released by the oxidation of glucose to make ATP, and that is what we do cellular work with. That's how we do the unfavorable things that have to get done to be a living organism. The product of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide and water, and those products are exactly what need to be fed in to photosynthesis. So we have this interdependency. We breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. Plants make glucose and we burn it, and the system is all self-supporting, but it all depends on bringing energy in from the sun. If the sun were to go out, then everything in the biosphere would die, because there wouldn't be an input of energy to make glucose and oxygen, and so there would be no energy available for any of the cells. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about that. The sun's going to stick around at least until the end of the semester, probably until the end of the next billion years. So hopefully this little unit helps us to understand a bit about metabolism and how it relates to life, to change, that energy drives change, and that change is living things. And I look forward to learning with you the other units about life.